we have had some extraordinary conversations in the Nation Conversation series with Reverend Barber, Bill McKibben, Alicia Garza, Naomi Klein, Pramila Jayapal. I'm very excited to have our guest today, Chris Hayes. Many of you probably see him every day, but here he is with us. I think when I think about my time at the Nation, hiring Chris to be the Nation's DC bureau chief at the age of 28 was one of the best moves made in my life. In 2007, I remember we sat in Union Square. I had just come from a postal hearing, the Government Oversight Committee, subcommittee, where Victor Navasky was testifying on postal rates and the need to secure, fund, and not privatize the postal service, something we're all aware of today. And Chris had been writing for In These Times, the Chicago Reader, and he was a brilliant writer. It was clear. I mean, he was writing on social issues, from union organizing to economic democracy to the intersection of politics and technology. His essays and articles were just extraordinary. And I remember he was reading Rick Hertzberg, who was the great New Yorker writer from Washington for many years, and wanted to figure out what he could do from Washington that would be distinctive. Well, I want to tell you, you probably know this, Chris, but Rick Hertzberg reads you now, and he admires you greatly. So terrific writer, but he was destined for TV. He began subbing for Rachel Maddow, Lawrence O'Donnell, and in 2011, I believe, I think young age of 33, Chris got a show, which in my mind to this day defines what TV could be. It was a 2-hour, many of you probably saw it, Up with Chris Hayes, 8 to 10 a.m. Saturday and Sunday. And Chris could do what he wanted. I mean, the show attracted a cult following, particularly among frustrated, hyper-educated members of the Occupy Wall Street generation, surprisingly fed up with partisan bickering that, let us say, continues to prevail. But Chris was always willing to challenge his own assumptions, and these were extraordinary conversations, half an hour devoted to corporate power, to Occupy Wall Street, to movements, to the power of criminal justice failures. So like Deadheads or Trekkies, fans of the program clustered under a name, a hashtag, uppers. Then the big move, and I think Chris was wary of it. I say this speaking too publicly, but to All In with Chris Hayes, 5 nights a week. And Chris knew in a way that you were in a different ballgame, but he is a multimedia powerhouse today. And I think if you listen to his podcast, Why Is This Happening? You see some of the remnants, not the remnants, the legacy of the Up with Chris. He tweets even while on set. It's crazy. He's just ferocious tweeter. And he has an extraordinary eye for guests. And he has had the progressive voice on for years before we're in this extraordinary ascendant moment. He's also has done some town halls. We were just talking. He did one with Bernie Sanders in Kenosha, which was really important to just hear people's voices. And he started doing, I think, every Friday a town hall, which can't do now, but they really offered a different format. He's the author of 2 books, and if you can believe it, he's working on a 3rd in this time. 2017, A Colony and a Nation, about how our ideas of policing and justice are informed by race in American history. And in 2012, very prescient, Twilight of the Elites, America After Meritocracy, to look at how our meritocracy establishment had rotted, which has learned how to define accountability down. Chris grew up in the Bronx, graduated from Brown University with a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy. And I was telling him, my daughter, who's a lawyer, really admires his wife, Kate Shaw, whose podcast you got to listen to, Strict Scrutiny. They have 3 kids. I can't believe I knew Chris when he was a kid. Anyway, over to you. It's great to have you, Chris.
It's great to be here.
And Chris is an editor, remains an editor at large, valued, and wrote some extraordinary articles, The New Abolitionism. He's always understood the danger, the threat of climate crisis before it has become so, well, it should be much more powerfully vivid in our media. He knows that. Anyway, great to have you. And
it's great to be here. Yeah, it's wonderful to, well, I guess see all you. Can I see all of you? I guess I can.
They can see you.
Oh, they can see me. Okay. I guess it's wonderful to see myself. And which is always distracting. It's a weird thing about the Zoom world, the panopticon that we're in, where we constantly are looking at ourselves. I mean, I was thinking about what to say today, and what I was remembering was almost exactly a year ago when we were just starting what Katrina talked about. We were doing these live shows. Someone's saying that they can't hear us. So
yeah, a little up, yeah.
Put my volume up. We were doing these live shows, and the live shows, one of the first ones was when the president, there was a hurricane that was headed, and he said it might hit Georgia and Alabama, and that was not true. And then the National Weather Service fielded a bunch of panicked calls, and then they were overridden. And then the president, remember, he displayed like a hurricane chart with a Sharpied in part that had the trajectory going up into Georgia and Alabama. I remember doing a long comedic bit on this, but also ending on the point of like, this stuff really matters. Like, crisis really matters. Crisis preparation really matters. These kinds of, these things matter. And the way that I was thinking a lot about the first part of the Trump administration was that it's very hard for humans to perceive the difference between tail risks. So, you know, if there's a 1 in a million chance that we have a nuclear war that, you know, kills tens of millions of people, and the president of the United States makes a bunch of decisions and actions that increase the odds of that by orders of magnitude to, say, 1 in 10,000. It appreciably made our lives much more dangerous, but the odds are it still won't happen, right? Like 1 in a million probably won't happen. 1 in 10,000 is, you know, much more likely, but also probably won't happen. And so it was kind of like the first few years of the Trump administration. I just think that all the signs were there was that we were collectively as a nation, as a people, and also in sort of a global sense, like playing an iterative game of Russian roulette. There was a bullet in the chamber, and there was a lot of chambers, and maybe we were going to keep clicking away, and we would get through 4 years without the gun going off, and we didn't. And in some ways, that is not surprising to me. In fact, that seemed clear. In fact, it was remarkable to me that there had not been larger catastrophes. And I think the real canary in the coal mine, the moment that I think in some ways a lot of the political conversation moved past at our peril, was Maria in Puerto Rico, where we got to see a glimpse of all of the sort of worst pathologies and worst impulses of like denial of the facts, contempt for people that he doesn't view as supporting him, the bigotry and the racism, and the lack of crisis management. All that came together, and, you know, thousands of people died in Maria, as the president was saying that, you know, the death toll was 15 or whatever. So we're now at this crisis point that in some ways was kind of inevitable or fated. There's also a democratic crisis happening at two levels. One is obviously the abuse of power of the president, and the sort of use of the tools of the state for the purposes of electoral advantage. And it's an interesting thing because that lies on a spectrum between incumbency advantage and outright criminal abuse of power. And everyone uses incumbency advantage, right? The bully pulpit and all that. The president has moved that spectrum towards outright abuse of power. And in some ways, the through line of him in elections is cheating. I mean, he solicited help in 2016. His number one henchman went to jail for a criminal felony committed to evade campaign finance disclosure laws. Cheating. He is trying to cheat again. He was impeached because he was trying to cheat. All of this is the through line. Like, the guy doesn't believe in free and fair elections in his core. And so when you add all this up, you know, I think the sort of desperate vortex dark feeling that a lot of people have is just staring down into a situation where at both the substantive level, independent of things like democratic health and rule of law, the country is objectively in a once-in-a-century catastrophe. More Americans have died in the last 4 months than in any 4 months in American history. The economic contraction is unrivaled in American history. We're going to start to see cascading effects of this, particularly if money doesn't come through for states and localities. You're going to start to see mass layoffs at the local level. You're going to start to see tightening austerity, cuts to social programs, up and down the chain. People are still dying from the virus, and there still is no plan to fight it. The University of Alabama has 560 cases in their first week back in Tuscaloosa because they just came back to Tuscaloosa and didn't, like, we keep trying the same thing, which is like, well, what if the virus didn't exist and we just went about life normally? And the answer to that is that does not work. That we could try it as many times as we want. It will continue to not work. So all of that together, it does make it feel like we're standing over the edge of something very deep and dangerous. And, you know, it's tempting always to ahistoricize, I think, and feel like this election is the most important, this moment is the most important crisis. But I think that if you, even in a historical sense, if you take a step back, there are a bunch of like macro structural trends that are bigger than Donald Trump that make this one of the most perilous and fraught moments for American democracy. Honestly, I think since the mid-19th century. I mean, that sounds hyperbolic, but I think that there's a strong sense in which the nature of what democratic representation in the American Republic looks like are sort of up in the air. You have now a minority faction of the country that has been governing the country from a minority position and essentially is committed to using its power to lock that in to the extent possible, has largely given up on appealing to a majority of the country. 6 out of the last 7 presidential elections, the Republicans have lost a plurality of the popular vote. If they do it again, 7 out of 8, which almost everyone, like, it's hilarious the degree to which that's just a given. Like, no one thinks he's going to win the popular vote. No one's had a worse run since the Democratic Party was founded under Andrew Jackson in the 1820s. So that's as bad as it gets. And yet, of course, they control the Supreme Court, they control a tremendous amount of state legislators, and they control the United States Senate, and the Electoral College gives them a structural advantage. And as our political polarization has diverged along the lines of structural, I'll get closer to my microphone. As political polarization has emerged exactly along the lines of a kind of structural imbalance in democratic representation, you have all the tools available for enduring minority rule. And that's what is right now being fought over. That's what's being contested. There's a reason Mitch McConnell spent all his time in this term getting judges confirmed, because judges are a anti-majoritarian bulwark that they can kind of retreat behind. As is the United States Senate, as is the Electoral College, and as are gerrymandered state and congressional districts. And so at a very fundamental level, the question in this country from the first moments of the Constitutional Convention is who should rule. And that's the most contested question. And the answer is, well, the people should rule. Well, who's the people? And that battle over who constitutes the vote, who constitutes the polity, who constitutes the people is in some ways a sort of central battle of American democracy, whether that's slavery, whether that's suffrage, whether that's the full and equal rights of Jim Crow, whether that's LGBT struggle for full citizenship for LGBT people to take part in the institution of legal marriage. Like, that is the sort of question. And who controls the levers of power? And we're at a very fraught moment where the project could kind of die. I mean, I don't want to sound overly grandiose, but democracies don't just last forever. Sometimes they just go downhill. And right now, the democratic health of the nation is very perilous. I would say that the one thing on the other end, I do think, like, the street uprisings and the protests of the last 4 months have been an incredibly hopeful sign, insofar as some kind of mobilization of that order is really the only protection. Like, if push comes to shove and we get a situation in which we are uncharted constitutional waters and uncharted legal waters, popular protest, people in the streets, a sort of refusal to accede to the whims of the ruler by the people that are ostensibly being governed is, ultimately the kind of last bastion of small d democracy. And I think people having the muscle memory of doing that is pretty important at this moment. But all this by way of saying, like, I think it's as bad as it looks. As someone who spends a lot of time thinking about it and talking to people about it, and it's a different universe now than it was before the pandemic, because of the, just the level of pain and anguish and the objective state of the country. The final thing I'll say is something I think about a lot is, which is both hopeful and unhopeful, is the 32 election in Hoover. Early on, I think I tweeted something about, we're about to find out what would happen if Hoover had Fox News. And I think that's basically right, although I actually think Hoover did a better job managing the first years of the Depression than Donald Trump has done managing the first few months of the pandemic. If you look back, the 32 election, of course, is the most iconic blowout of a incumbent in history, and is not really repeated, I think, until Reagan beats Carter in 1980. Hoover got 40% of the vote, 39.75% of the vote in 1932. 40 is basically the lowest it goes. I think Goldwater gets 38 or 39. Like that's about the bottom of what you can get. The president's approval rating is about 41%. He's polling around 40% in a lot of polls. Like, now, at some level, you think to yourself, how in the world could he be polling at 40%? How can it be the case? But then at the other, it's like, that's about as low as it gets. Like, that's basically, Hoover got 40%. So, you basically can't, it's very hard to get below 40%. So that to me is kind of a useful way of looking at it both as the glass half full and half empty, which is like, holy crap, 4 out of 10 Americans are like, this is good. I want more of this. I think we should stay on this track. But also that 4 out of 10 Americans also thought that about Herbert Hoover in 1932. Like, let's keep it going, guys. So, that's just basically, that's your baseline is 4 out of 10 people being like, cool. So that I think gives me a little bit of hope, but beyond that, it's like, it's real dangerous and it's real bad. And, things fall apart. Sometimes entropy wins, and just exercising the muscles of democratic citizenship is basically all we have left.
We have lots of questions, and thank you for that. And I want to build a little bit on your opening, but also when we were able to be in a room together, you joined the Nation for a breakfast, and in your remarks, you said that that Trump's superpower is his complete inability to feel shame, and it seems like that superpower might be contagious. And so we have what feels like a whole Republican Party who is now lacking that ability to feel shame and has abdicated their responsibility in flexing muscles of democracy. And I guess I wonder if you have an opinion about what's going on there, and what does it take to change it, and do we need them?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I do think that internal guardrails do matter a certain amount. And the funny thing is, they have exercised internal guardrails on certain things. Like, if Donald Trump came out and really wanted to raise taxes on rich people, there would be a full-on revolt in the Republican Party. They have revolted against certain key nominees to important positions. If he tried it, there was one point in which there was tiny little bit of scuttlebutt about putting his sister on the Supreme Court. They would not allow that. They would not allow Like, there are things they care about and things they don't care about. And that's one of the most important things to understand, is that, like, when they don't speak up, when they don't fight back, it's because they agree with him or they don't care. So, like, they don't care that he wants to ban every Muslim. They don't care about the subversion of the rule of law and the, you know, what he's doing right now on mail-in voting and the sort of destruction of free and fair elections. They don't care. They don't care. Like, they do care about some things, and they will stand up to him when they do. So that said, it also is the case that, like, someone's saying I'm crying.
They're crying.
Okay. I really nailed it. You know, it also is the case that, like, it will matter what the Republican leadership does and says, particularly if we reach some period of post-election constitutional crisis. Like, so yeah, it still will matter if Mitch McConnell says, like, no, Joe Biden is a president and Donald Trump is not. Will he ever do that? I don't know. But those validators do make a difference. The sort of the voices on Fox News and the Republican Party and a critical mass of Republicans stepping forward to be like, no, Donald Trump lost the election, like, that will matter, actually. Whether they'll ever do that, like, I have no expectation they will, which is why I think that, you know, we're the only ones saving us. In terms of the shamelessness, I agree it's contagious. I mean, the Hatch Act stuff last night is a perfect example where that stuff only, the shaming for it only works if people are capable of feeling shame. Otherwise, it's just like, what are you going to do? And I do think there's a degree to which there are certain adaptive lessons the next Democratic president should learn from that, which is like, the things to think about front of mind are the democratic health of the country, the integrity of the rule of law, and, like, acting in an ethical manner. But, like, norms qua norms are meaningless. Like, some norms are good and some are bad. Like, you know, it was a norm not to run for a third election before the, you know, Constitution changed, and FDR broke it, and he was right to. So, you know, I feel like sometimes there's a kind of very deep inborn institutionalism among particularly the kind of Democratic governing class. I think partly born of the fact that, like, it tends to be people that have come up through this sort of meritocratic funnel, and they kind of believe in the institutions. And I think often quite admirably so. I think we've seen the flip side of what it means if you have, like, a nihilistic contempt for them and you think it's all BS, like, people act corruptly. So I think it's, like, not a bad thing that people have this belief in the institutions. But I also think that, like, a little tincture of that sort of, like, let them try to force me. Like, better to ask for forgiveness and permission. Like, that's not the worst lesson for the next Democratic administration, if we ever have one, to learn.
Can you talk a little bit about what the media's responsibility is in informing citizens of what's going on? And Kenneth King's specific question is, why is it when politicians lie, commentators never use the word lie? So what is the media's responsibility in making people understand what's going on?
I mean, I think that I think a lot of the critiques of the media have been totally on point about Trump, but I also think that one of the things you have to integrate is that, like, the media has gotten better about all these things over the course of his administration, and it has mattered not one whit to his approval rating. Like, you have like the New York Times and the Washington Post going as far as I've ever seen them go in their language about calling things racist, or, you know, like, Trump's total sort of sociopathic behavior has forced legacy media institutions to be much more forthright than they've ever been before. And it doesn't penetrate with the 40%. So, like, I think people have this idea that, like, well, the media is, like, tells people the truth and, like, he won't get away with it. But it's like, a huge part of the project of conservatism for the last 40 or 50 years is undermining any trust in, like, the legacy media. So, like, they don't care. Like, if it came out tomorrow that Donald Trump had personally had a child shot and killed, the degree to which that would affect his standing would depend on whether you believe that reporting. Mm-hmm. So if the people that are telling you that, yes, like, there's actual evidence that he ordered a murder or he did some horrible thing, it would depend entirely on the trust of the mediating institution. And if people don't have trust in the mediating institution, they're just going to say, like, that's a lie, it didn't happen. And so I agree that, like, it's been maddening to watch a lot of mainstream media institutions deal with acclimating themselves to how aberrant the president is and being dragged to come out and say obvious things like the president is lying. And that's been painful. But in some ways, it's like, I don't think that's the biggest problem from a media standpoint. The biggest problem is like for instance, the mainstream media is not running around saying that, like, 5G caused coronavirus and Bill Gates has a big plan to, like, get rid of world population by seeding a virus and then giving a vaccine. Like, that's, the New York Times isn't doing that, but that's everywhere. like there are people you are friends with who are posting on that. And so, like, the sort of the most toxic elements, and this is not to say that, like, the media has done a great job in the Trump era, because, like, there's a huge amount of problems the way they've handled him, the addiction to attention, these sort of standard, like, it always seems so preposterous when they, like, apply these, like, normal ways of talking about a president or whatever to this guy or what he's doing, you know. Well, maybe the president's plan to announce a vaccine might help him, you know. All of that is true. It's just that, like, the things I'm most worried about have to do with things that have nothing to do with the way that, like, the New York Times covers Donald Trump.
Maybe you can comment on Nancy Pelosi's endorsement of Kennedy. Yezdiar is asking, you know, what do you think of that? And is that how do progressives react?
The whole thing is so bizarre. I really, like, to me, two things. It seems just like a House versus Senate turf war. But the other thing I would say is that, like, I honestly think that, you know, one of the things Newt Gingrich did in 1994 was he term limited chairs. And that completely transformed the Republican caucus. And there's many ways in which it transformed the Republican caucus in terrible ways. It invested more power. It took power away from the chairs. So you didn't have these, like, powerful committee chairs. The Democrats have not done that. They still have a seniority system. And, like, look at who's chairing the various committees. They are the people that have seniority. They are the old guard. Now, their politics range. You have Maxine Waters, who's the chair of Finance Committee, and you have Richie Neal, who's the chair of Ways and Means, right? These are people with very different relationships to corporate power, but they're both, like, old guard people. Like, they've been there for a while. They literally have seniority. So what it means is, if you're a young, ambitious member of Congress, there's nowhere to go. So in a weird thing, the whole Kennedy primarying is like a pressure release valve for Clyburn and Hoyer and Pelosi and all those people, for a young buck who wants to, like, climb up and has nowhere to go in the House because it's all the same committee chairs up at the top. I think there's like a weird sort of, like, oh, well, let him go challenge Markey. Like, that's where this young fella can go to move up the ladder, because there's nowhere to move up in House leadership, because it's so sort of occupied at the top by people with literally decades of seniority. So I think that's a huge part of it. I would, if I were in, you know, I don't think there's any reason for Markey not to be the senator from Massachusetts based on his record. I don't understand the logic of this challenge. The only way to understand it is, to me, is in these sort of narrow institutional ways.
So an anonymous attendee asks about the future of the Republican Party, and this is a little bit of a hopeful question. So once Trump exits the stage, how is this going to go for people like Rubio and Scott, some of the younger people? How are they going to come out unscathed for people who have been tying their futures to Trump's wagon? And maybe a little bit on what you think the future of the GOP might be.
Yeah, I think it's a really open question. I don't know the answer. One thing I would say is, in the short term, he's not going to exit the stage. Like, if Donald Trump loses in 2020, he is the immediate front runner for the Republican nomination in 2024. There's just no question about that. I don't even think it's close. Like, that will be and it doesn't matter how old he's going to be. He'll be a year older than Biden is now. So he's not going anywhere in the short term. I think that I think the question about the reason this election is so important is that whether you can kind of, here's what I would say. The best case scenario for American governance is what happened in California. California was a notoriously ungovernable state for much of the early part of my journalistic career. In fact, I was a fellow at New America Foundation. They had a whole like California wing, and it was all about how like the property tax caps combined with this intransigent Republican Party and the budgetary supermajority rules meant that like they can never deliver a budget, they can never fund their public service. Like they're basically constantly in shutdown and crisis, the state, from a governing perspective. And what ended up happening was that like Democrats just destroyed the Republican Party. They just beat them into a pulp, and they're now basically a permanent minority rum caucus, and the state became governable. Now, it didn't mean when the state of California became governable that all the problems were solved, like, or all political conflict went away. There's tons of things people fight about in California, in city politics, in local politics, in state politics. Like, people don't agree on things. That's the nature of politics. It just means that like the parameters of the disagreement are not like a like retrograde anti-democratic like proto-fascist revanchist movement that like doesn't want the state to function. It means that like people are fighting about like, should the police budget be smaller or larger? Should it like what should tuition be at the University of California schools? Like these sort of questions that people fight about, and there's still special interest there, and there's still a lot of control by the wealthy, and there's still tremendous inequality. But it's a state where like politics can happen in a way that it kind of couldn't happen before, because there was essentially a kind of hijacking sabotage by the Republican Party. And so honestly, that's the best case scenario for America, which is that the sort of generational and demographic change of the country and the sort of adherence to this specific politics or reaction backfires enough on the Republican Party that they become like essentially reduced to a minority.
We've all seen these really frightening pictures of armed militias at protests, and the sort of discomfort with seemingly walking around with a machine gun. If you use Portland as a backdrop, Marilyn Sanders is wondering if the stories that she's seen are true, that the Portland police have given up on controlling the far-right protesters that are armed with automatic assault rifles. If you know if that's true, and what do you make of it? And what do you make of this rise of armed militia in our streets?
Well, I think that there's been a lot. I can't speak in any global sense to what was happening in the streets of Portland because I wasn't there. I've sort of interacted with the reporting the same way everyone else has. I think it's been pretty clear that like it has often been the case that Portland police are very wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and very look the other way with certain elements of the far right there, who they feel, personal ideological affinity for. Some do. And this is sort of an ongoing thing in Portland where there's been a long, oh, sorry, I have to be louder. Well, there's been a long back and forth between sort of Antifa forces and Proud Boys and things like that. I think that, look, America is an incredibly armed place. It has a long history of armed right-wing reactionary violence. That armed right-wing reactionary violence has been incredibly effective. I mean, one of the most effective political movements in American history was the Campaign Against Reconstruction, which was waged largely as a violent vigilante movement that was utterly effective, completely won. I mean, a white mob literally took over the town of Wilmington, North Carolina in 1893 through force. Like it was an integrated town, it was a Reconstruction era town, and a white vigilante mob just took the town. And they chased all the black people out and beat and killed them. So there's a long history of white vigilante mob. I mean, it was how the West was won. Like, yes, the US Army did a lot of it, but also a lot of settlers just went and committed a lot of lawless violence against indigenous people. So there's a long history of right-wing vigilante violence. There's a long history of an armed nation. And it's extremely upsetting to watch this. I mean, this is the thing I'm most worried about what's happening on the streets right now is I saw last night the images coming out of Kenosha, and I saw a lot of people with guns. I didn't know who they were. Some of them might be militias. Some of them were business owners. Some of them seemed to be protesters, like BLM protesters. But I just think like a lot of guns in that situation is a horrible idea and a horrible recipe for bad stuff. And I worry, you know, the worst militia violence in this country, and there's been a huge amount of right-wing violence happening in this country in the last few years under Donald Trump, but the apex of it was probably under Bill Clinton. Mm-hmm. And one really does worry about what that movement would do under a Biden presidency, like in terms of organized violent backlash. That's a real thing to consider.
Moving on to slightly more hopeful, there's lots of talk of if Biden and Kamala win, who takes that Senate seat. And certainly read talks of Katie Porter. Jordan Weltman is wondering if Adam Schiff might want that seat. Or
Adam Schiff wants that seat. Not a question of whether he wants that seat, a question of whether he'll get it. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people, again, California is one of those places, it's a huge state with a lot of Democratic politicians and not a lot of spots to go. So it would be a really interesting choice for Newsom. You know, people have talked about Barbara Lee. People have talked about Adam Schiff. One person I've heard mentioned also is Javier Becerra, who's, you know, he would be the first Latino U.S. senator in California state history, which is remarkable to consider that they have not had one, given the sort of history of Chicanos in that state. So, but yes, Adam Schiff would definitely like to be a U.S. senator. If that is the question, I can answer that definitively.
Marjorie Harrison is wondering if you have opinions on the selection of more veterans by the Democratic congressional leadership and the impact of, in quote, security Democrats on congressional politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like, I think there's kind of a big argument yet to be had, I think, about Democratic foreign policy and Democratic sort of military posture that hasn't quite played out enough. I mean, I think some of it started to in the primary. There definitely is Biden is a very kind of throwbacky guy, I think, particularly on foreign policy. The sort of nationals, the sort of the NatSec community, you know, who individually, you know, are perfectly good people, some extremely talented and smart, some of whom were my friends. But sort of as a collective, I think are pretty blinkered. So I don't know. There's going to be a lot of arguments to have. I mean, it's interesting to me that how much that has receded as a front of mind issue. I do worry about the China situation. That, you know, for all the talk about U.S. and Russia and you know, the sort of Cold War echoes, like that's where the real fear, the real possibility of a new Cold War is with China. Like that could happen. We could enter into a period in which the U.S. and China, quote, disentangle in a way that essentially leads to proxy violence wars, you know, sort of carving up the world into dual spheres of influence. We could go down that path with China. And, you know, the Chinese government is really brutal and really awful right now in many ways. And negotiating what that bilateral relationship looks like is really thorny with no clear, obvious answer. And so, you know, I think you need smart, capable people dealing with that question, there's not a huge roadmap on that. I mean, to me, that's the kind of number one geopolitical question, you know, going into the rest of the century. And I think there's really divided views. And I don't think there's a lot of consensus in the Democratic Party on that.
We have a question about MSNBC and MSNBC's coverage of Sanders' campaign and the primaries, and it's from UUs for Justice in the Middle East. The question is, what is your view of MSNBC's persistent attacks that damaged Bernie Sanders' candidacy?
I mean, I think that individual people I think that there are a range of views of Bernie Sanders. I think most of the hosts probably were not big Bernie Sanders fans. They probably wouldn't have voted for him. Or they wouldn't, his politics were not their politics. I'm not sure, again, I don't know what the influence of that was in terms of the outcome of the primary. I think that there was an enormous generational divide.
Mm-hmm.
It was the biggest divide in the Democratic primary was a generational one. I can just say that like our audience, my audience really, the most vocal members of my audience hated Bernie Sanders. They just did. Like every time we had him on, they hated him. And they would let me know that. They would email me, and you know, our audience is, you know, if we do 2 million total viewers and we do 300,000 in the demo, that's 1.7 million people who are over the age of 55. Like, in some ways, it's just generational math. Like, the MSNBC audience skews older. That's an empirical fact. Bernie Sanders support skews younger. That's an empirical fact. And like, when you added the two together, you got what you got. Like on our network, honestly, like it just was the case in the same way that like, there's not a ton of like super psyched up Joe Biden activity happening on Reddit or on like just launched podcasts. Like where were the Joe Biden podcasts? Like, yeah, generationally, that was not the Biden base. The people that like those forms of media, which are inhabited by people of a certain age, like not a real Biden hotspot. And I think ultimately, like, I understand why people understood it as a kind of political, like an ideological statement, which I think to some extent that was true. I mean, like Chris Matthews is no longer there. Like Chris Matthews clearly is not a Bernie Democrat. Like Chris Matthews doesn't like Bernie Sanders politics. That was not masked in any way. Like he just doesn't like Bernie Sanders politics. But to me, a huge part of it was just the generational skew. And the generational skew as sort of also balkanized through different media channels. So like there's an entire ecosystem of extremely pro-Bernie media, right? Like to a kind of, almost in a sort of old school factional sense, right? Like publications that were just like indistinguishable from the Sanders movement, sort of self-consciously. MSNBC was not that.
Well, so you just mentioned the Biden not being a hotspot, but you know we need Biden and Harris to be a hotspot. We need them to have energy and excitement around them. And so, what do you think are options for the progressive wing of the Democratic Party to make inroads with that ticket? How do we push them on things that we think are important?
Honestly, I don't like right now. I think. To me, this moment is just like so perilous and fraught. And like, I just think that like defeating Trump in the next 70 days is basically everything. I do. I just don't like it, and you know, there's going to be a bunch of battles to be had about staffing the administration, which I think really matters a lot, people's policy. And I think who gets in there really will matter a huge amount. I think that, you know, Rahm Emanuel's chief of staff was probably the single biggest setback for progressive forces in the Obama administration.
Oh.
It really mattered a lot that he was the chief of staff. So I think personnel is policy, and I think that those would be big fights and important fights. Who's in the room? What parts of the coalition are they representing? And then there's going to be fights about prioritization, which again are going to be brutal fights. Like and this thing would drive me crazy about Bernie Sanders. Every time I interview him, I'd say, well, what are you going to prioritize? Well, we can walk and chew gum. You can do, no, you can't. Like, you can't, literally, definitionally, you can't prioritize everything. The definition of priority is that something comes first. You can't prioritize everything. Like, and that's true about legislative sequencing. It's true about what you put your political capital behind. And there's going to be, and again, if the Biden-Harris ticket comes into the White House, they will come in amidst crisis again. Like, it's going to be hard. I think, you know, the big thing to me, the two big things to push on, the most important things to push on, or three most important things to push on are personnel and policy. Forget deficits and austerity. Forget it. Write it out of your brain. Treat the deficit the way Republicans do. We'll deal with it later. Just don't worry about it. Don't. And bond markets are fine. The Fed is floating everyone. Interest rates are zero, or near the zero bound. There's essentially no inflation. Like, there are actual set of macroeconomic conditions in which a deficit might be quite worrisome for a given nation that doesn't have the reserve currency. Those actually exist, and they're tough. If you're running a government that has a current account deficit and a devaluing currency, and you're sitting on dollars and they're flying out the door, and you're about to basically essentially go bankrupt, like, you can't just like pretend that doesn't exist. You know, ask Argentina, right? Like, those are real factors. The US is not in that condition, so like, don't worry about it. And then the third thing is like climate.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mike D has a question. He says, I'm a retired teacher, union president, and unionist my whole life. I'm troubled by the conflict regarding the role of police unions. How do you reconcile their legitimate right to represent their members with their repressive stand so many take on race and social issues?
I don't know how you reconcile those. That's a great question. I mean, you know, Eve Ewing's got a great piece in Vanity Fair about police unions where she says they're essentially fraternal organizations, much more than they are sort of like, you know, labor organizations. But yeah, it's a really tough one. Like, you know, if you believe in the right to collectively bargain, then everyone gets the right to collectively bargain. And there are reasons that you would, you know, police forces, police are workers. I mean, I think some people think they're, you know, the guardians of capital or whatever, and therefore are sort of defined out of the class of workers. But they're workers, and they, you know, they have workplace issues, and they have safety issues to think about, and pay and benefits. But yeah, police unions are really insidious forces, unequivocally, in the public sphere. And I never stop being shocked at the rhetoric of police unions. It's the most sort of forthrightly authoritarian, like even more than Trump. It's really nuts.
I want to just get in two questions before we turn it back to Katrina to close, and also to let you know that you've probably been looking at the chat, but there are lots of expressions of thanks and gratitude to you, and hope that in your next book tour that you stop in every place that showed up too. Vinnie McGee wonders, in your as you were starting out, was Wayne Barrett one of your mentors, and what did you learn from him? And
I didn't know Wayne. I mean, I have interacted with him, and I've had him on the show and talked to him, but I read Wayne religiously, and yeah, I mean, he's a legend for a reason, and he definitely had Trump's number very early on. I just wrote a blurb for his there's collected writings of his about to come out that I just blurbed. That's really good, which I recommend people go pick up.
And for just the last question, you know, is it possible to end on a note of hope? You know, what do you see happening now that is hopeful?
Yeah, I mean, what's hopeful is that people, like the movements that we've seen in the streets are the largest, basically the largest protest movement in American history, as far as we can tell, like as an empirical matter. Um, you know, I think it's sort of hopeful to think that we're all that can save us, because that's not like, doesn't put us in position of waiting for some other person to ride in. The other thing that's hopeful is, like, again, like I said, 60% of the country doesn't freaking like the guy. Like we are in the majority. We have been in the majority the whole time. We were in the majority in 2016. We're in the majority now. Like the structural features of American constitutional democracy don't mean that you get to rule when you're in the majority. But it is the case that, like, he has lost a majority of the country. He has never governed from a majority of the country. I mean, if we were in a situation where you 60% approval, we would be toast democratically. We would be Erdogan's Turkey. We like it. So, like, don't doubt yourself. You're what can save us in terms of, like, being an active citizen. That means, like, voting, getting other people to vote, volunteering for local races, particularly protesting. And also that, like, he's not popular. So don't psych yourself out that he is.
Chris, so it's a good way to end, because there were quite a few people in the chat room while you spoke saying, I'm crying again. But you don't leave us crying. What you did today was you took us really deep. And I think it's really important to be reminded of the structural imbalance of our democracy. I mean, we don't talk enough about the courts, the Electoral College, the Senate as kind of a racist institution, why we need to take back the state legislatures. Obama was reminded of it when he was in Constitution Hall the other night with his great speech, but also why we need to, begin using our muscle memory muscle of democracy. And thank you for being so honest about the media, and hopeful about what people in the streets, movements can do, and also the priorities. We do need to defeat Trump and Trumpism. And the priorities, personnel, equal policy, the Green New Deal, if we can move it. And I agree with you about, forget the deficits. If Peter just sent out a link, I'd suggest two great essays of Chris's, Weapons of Mass Deficits and The New Abolitionism, which is what it's about, climate and the imperative of treating climate as seriously as it demands in the context of race, slavery. But thank you, Chris. And we got to get you back writing for the Nation.
Yeah.
And everyone has to look out for his new book. Thank you for closing out our conversation series. This is the last one of the summer. October 7th, we have someone who relates to what Chris was talking about, Jamal Bowman, who beat multi-term Elliot Engel for a seat in Congress.
My brother was his campaign manager, right?
Yeah, and I think his victory, along with a few others in that New York election, was a great indicator of the progressive kind of insurgent infrastructure that does give hope. So join us. I think we're going to have Jamal Bowman, and we may have a former Nation intern, Ari Berman, come on to talk about one of the key, we didn't talk a lot about voter suppression, but boy, is that baked in as well as a structural imbalance. So let's end by thinking about how we, who converts the levers of power, and remind that the people are supposed to rule. And Chris, thank you for taking time out of your really busy schedule.
All right, be good, guys.
Take care.
Don't despair. Stay at it.
Thank you.